You're good to start, William.
Oh, great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm William Crowder, a founding partner at Aperture Venture Capital, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to kick this amazing conference off. And I'd like to thank the members of the CVC team that were crazy enough to ask me to speak with you today. My goals today are pretty simple. One, I hope to say something that's useful to all of you. Two, I'd like to make this as interactive as possible despite it being virtual. So we'll look forward to having some questions and answers towards the end. And then lastly, and this will probably be the hardest thing for me, is I want to do those things while making it look like I'm speaking to you directly and not directly into my keyboard. So I'll try to keep the Zoom eye contact at the right level. We'll see how this goes. I'd really like to start. This off with a story that I think really best illustrates why this topic of corporate diversity programs is so relevant to today's event. It's not something that I've ever shared with anyone in a public setting, but I think it's something that's long overdue. About 8 years or so ago, I was playing a pretty significant role with a major diversity effort for a large corporation. And I was having a conversation, there's actually a series of conversations with some of the senior leadership of that effort. And we were having a series of conversations about the go forward plan and what was this going to look like in the next several months and the next couple of years. And during that conversation, I was told the following. So number one, you're leading this effort because we needed a Black person to be in charge. And the actual quote was actually a bit more jarring because the actual quote was that we needed an African or some other minority to be the face of this effort. The second thing was that I was told to not feel compelled to do the actual work. That this is, for lack of a better term, this is performative theater for the regulators. The third thing was that we only agreed to do this stuff in order to get our merger approved. And then the fourth major takeaway was that I would not be paid anything associated with the value I was creating or anything that would be tied to the results that were achieved. And so now keep in mind that I was leading a venture capital fund as part of this broader diversity effort. So by its very definition, I was supposed to generate value. I was supposed to generate returns and create value for the company. And so how in the world can an effort like this be taken seriously, internally or externally, with so many hindrances? And so I would say that it's doable because I went through it. It's doable, but it requires so many compromises and adjustments that, you just have to do that just to get the bare minimum accomplished. And when you're talking about true diversity, it can't be achieved by just doing the bare minimum. It literally requires more from the organization. And so why did I choose that particular story? Why did I want to share that with you? And I think many of you are graduates of business school, or you likely studied business in some capacity over the years, and therefore you're quite familiar with the case methodology of teaching. It can be very painful. I remember it well, but it can also be extremely instructive and effective for thought provocation. And so let's think about that situation and then remove me from it and think about what it means when an organization takes that type of approach. All the signals, the messages being delivered, they all suggest that this is a meaningless endeavor from the perspective of diversity, and that we'll do anything we have to do to get what we want. But what this means is that we're going to do the things that we perceive to be more valuable, And those things that we perceive to be more valuable are more valuable than whatever it is that you're doing. So, I mean, let's be honest, we all know what's the purpose of a corporation. The purpose of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value. And so corporations don't do the things that create less value over the things that could create more. And so when you have this type of situation, what you have is a perfect example of what the corporation values, where this particular effort might rank amongst all the other things that it may consider to be priorities as well. And so if we really dig into this and use this as an example of what's happened, and I think it is, I don't think it's unique to this particular organization I was doing this work for. We see there are several problems, and that if we peel back those layers, we'll also see that these are some of the same problems that show up in nearly every corporate diversity program today. Problem number one, wrong leadership and mandate. The person that delivered those messages to me was not the person that was publicly responsible for the overall effort. In fact, they reported to the publicly facing individual. And so that individual, the publicly facing individual, the person that was in theory held to the highest account for the effectiveness of this broader corporate diversity program, they said all the right things externally. They had everyone feeling like this was the right thing to do and this was going to be wonderful. It was something that hadn't really been embarked upon before. But the team that was responsible for ensuring that the work actually got done had a completely different perspective. They had a different perspective about why they were doing it, what it really meant. And in many cases, it wasn't an effort that really even resonated with who they were as an individual. So they didn't care about it, not in the way that it needed to be cared about. So that's a big problem. And it's something that I would say that we see in many other instances as well. Problem number two, performance theater. And quite frankly, performance theater is not okay, but it has been. It has been recognized. People have called it for what it is. And they have, as you would at a theater, watched the event. They've watched it happen without intervening to prevent that from happening ever again. And so we've seen figureheads and placeholders utilized to the benefit of the organization, not in a situation in which they're going to drive the actual change that we want to see, but they're there. It's enough so that no one asks any deep questions and they can keep things moving. Third problem, doing it for the wrong reasons. And when we talk about diversity programming, especially with corporations, it should be about addressing the issues of diversity. Like that should be the problem that's being addressed. That is the problem. It shouldn't be used as a negotiating chip to achieve some other quote unquote higher priority. The reason that these programs should exist should be to address and solve that particular diversity related problem. And then lastly, the fourth problem, is perhaps one of the biggest ones, which is this absence of incentives. Nothing matters more to corporate executives than the answer to the question, how will this further my career? And in the grand scheme of things, no incentives means it doesn't matter. Misalignment of incentives sends mixed messages throughout the organization. And in many cases, it paralyzes decision-making. And so in my view, that has been one of the most fatal flaws of nearly all corporate diversity efforts to date. And you say, well, why would you say nearly all corporate diversity efforts? Because there's certainly examples of things that have worked well. Well, my perspective is a little different. My perspective on that is that we've been talking about corporate diversity programs for quite some time. And if we've been speaking about those things for quite some time, then hopefully there's been a significant amount of progress and that the conversation can revolve around what else can be done to move this ball a little bit further. But instead, I think many of us have found that we've been having the same conversations in these just almost discrete intervals I can go back 10 years and I can say that we've been having the same conversation around diversity and venture capital. It's a perfect example that they're having today. We had that in 2010, 2011, 2012. So the fact that we're having that same conversation again would suggest then, therefore, nothing has really changed, which would also mean that whatever it was that had been done wasn't as effective as it was supposed to be. So that's why I would make the claim that we haven't been as effective with our corporate diversity programs as we should have been, because we're having the same conversation today in 2021 that we had in 2011 and that we had in 2001 and years prior. So, you know, one of the issues then is this notion that our corporate diversity activities and efforts have largely been reduced to cost centers and requirements. They're requirements-driven activities. And instead, they should be viewed as value creators and as revenue generators, because nothing really galvanizes organizations around anything like revenue generation and value creation. Everyone can get behind that within the organization. And so when you don't have that, what you end up with is begrudging leadership. You end up with minimal senior level buy-in or allyship, and you don't get that full organizational alignment and engagement that you could really capitalize on. When that organizational alignment exists, amazing things happen. Transformative and systemic changes emerge. And these decisions move markets and they create new industries. So why not view diversity for what it really is? You know, we have at Aperture, we have an advisor, someone who said something extremely insightful to us before before we saw the parade of PR announcements, et cetera, last summer following the murder of George Floyd. And what she said to us is that corporations have yet to fully recognize that from a diversity standpoint, this is an existential crisis for them, and that it's time for them to act accordingly. She said that there is a fiduciary imperative for organizations to invest and engage in addressing this issue. In other words, there is real money to be made in the process of doing the right thing. And so, again, how am I so sure that that's the case? Well, let's look no further than the title of this conference. It literally says the multicultural mainstream in its title. The multicultural mainstream is a social environment that is more colorful, it's more female, and is more dispersed. These are major drivers of the next economy and thus the most important components to the future of business. It would be a major mistake to ignore the power of these trends. Look at what's happened just since May of last year. In the wake of all those protests and all of the other movements, to see some substantial changes occur when the world has effectively stopped because of the pandemic. We have seen this monumental collision of culture and business, and we've seen it in the form of Nike supporting the protest of its athletes, Square spending nearly $500 million to acquire multiple companies with Black ownership and with customer bases that are reflective of that ownership. We've seen sneaker exchanges reach unicorn status and make plans to go public. And we've seen the rise of SPACs, even to the point that now we're seeing SPACs being launched by women and by people of color with a specific purpose in mind to acquire more companies that better represent the multicultural mainstream. So there's already a reckoning that's taking place that confirms the arrival of the multicultural mainstream, and its importance is only going to grow in the coming years. So that means that this idea that corporations can just get by with what they've done before, that's not going to be sufficient anymore. It literally will leave you out of step with the way that our world is changing going forward. So what does it really mean for corporate diversity programs? Like, what should they look like in 2021 and beyond? And I have some ideas about that. And I'm not suggesting that these are the only ones. But based on my experience and the things that I've seen in my conversations with a number of large corporations and analyzing the way that they're approaching this new period in time, I think there's some other things that we can really do. And there's some ways to think about it in your own respective organizations, or just as an individual who is thinking about their future and where it makes sense to plug in from a strategic perspective. So one, I think we have to start thinking about the end game, or thinking with the end game in mind. What is it that we're trying to do? What is it that we want to accomplish? And how will our company and how will our world be different if we are successful? There's been too much focus on the here and now, and not enough focus on the path ahead. So we already know we're going to be doing some things. There's actually no reason to have the press release to say, hey, just want to let you know that we're going to be allocating this amount of capital and we're going to do the following 4 or 5 things. It's far more impactful for you to say we're doing that, but then to also be willing to come back and say, this is how things are progressing. And ideally, when we are successful, this is how the world will be different. Second, the programs have to be linked to the strategic relevance of the company. It's the strategic relevance of the company that gets everyone willing to engage and willing to consider the possibilities. What will be our ROI and what will be the ROE of this effort? The ROI, return on the investment. The ROE is not the return on equity, it's the return on engagement. So this is not about just saying we're going to do some things and we're going to put some money against it. This is about getting everyone galvanized and saying there's a role that I can play in this, and I'm getting engaged in that effort. The third thing is what I call empowering non-traditional leadership with capital and authority. These are the people that represent parts of the organization that are, in many cases, are not the ones that people bring to the table when it's time to drive real change related to diversity. These are the folks that are in treasury, the people that are in the corporate VC group, the people that are in your corporate development function. They should be included in this new corporate diversity model. The traditional stuff has been nice. We've seen these things that we can kind of go down chapter and verse. We know all the things that people will generally say they're going to do when something major happens and there needs to be a corporate response. We're going to get more, more Black and brown people on our board. We're going to find more women and promote them to senior leadership positions. We're going to give to certain charities and nonprofit causes, and we're going to change our programming or modify our products in ways that are more respectful to our more diverse consumer sets. That's the playbook. That's the playbook that has existed for many decades. That playbook is not sufficient anymore. When you start to engage non-traditional leaders within your organization, what you start to do is you open up the opportunity for new ideas and new thinking. Let me give you some examples. And these are just some of the things that I've seen lately that I believe exemplify that new way of thinking. There are things that perhaps other organizations are going to copy. I hope they do. But hopefully, more importantly, it will start to spark some real conversation and some idea generation in your own respective organizations. So investing in diverse managers of venture funds, Apple, Google, and several others have made this a priority for them, for their respective organizations. Re-examining the economic health of your employees and innovatively addressing their needs. That's something that PayPal has been doing. If you look at Dan Schulman and you look at some of the things that he has been very vocal about, that's one of the things that I think is really has not gotten enough attention, is that they looked at the economic health of their employees and they said, we've got to set a minimum wage, if you will, for everyone that works here. It's not acceptable to have anyone making these trade-offs about what it is that they're going to eat or how they're going to travel to the office, et cetera, when they work at a company that's been as successful as ours has been. adjusting your treasury policy to ensure that capital flows through diverse communities. Netflix and ServiceNow are two companies that have made that a priority and have made major announcements about how they're going to do that. And now you're seeing more and more organizations start to entertain these ideas as well. These are just the beginning, but you'll notice that these are ideas that don't organically generate from the traditional places and faces within a corporation. These are the ideas coming from the people that have built their careers on investing and built their careers on revenue generation. So you need to have them involved and have them at the table as well. And then you've got to reward top performance and align the incentives with the value creation. Remember, this is no longer a cost center. This is something that can create real competitive advantage for your corporation, and therefore it needs to be treated with that same level of importance and focus and dedication. And then lastly, don't do it alone. Corporations have to stop seeking the sole credit. There's always been this race for the press release. And in the rush to do that, I think there's something that's been missed every single time. And that is taking an ecosystem approach such that there is a multiplying effect on your impact. So when we think about these corporations, and the corporations that we think have been, iconic brands, and they've become extremely successful over the years, none of them have done that by themselves. They've got a network of suppliers and other relationships for distribution and other channels. They've got a lot of other entities that have helped them become who they are. And so no one company can solve a problem that has been created by many. A problem that's been created by so many. So the idea that one corporation is going to step into the breach and say, hey, we're going to solve the diversity problem is nonsensical. It's not possible. But what is possible is to have a much more dramatic impact across your industry or multiple industries by engaging your other partners and saying, let's work together to amplify the $100 million commitment, the $1 billion commitment that we're making to this particular effort. What happens when we take our capital and our resources and we combine it with yours and yours and yours, we're already strategically partnered. Let's work together to solve one of the toughest problems facing our particular industry and our society at large. So just imagine what would happen if Nike or Verizon said, we're pulling in all of our ad agencies, all of our retail partners, and we're all going to make a dramatic difference in the lives of all of the people who work here that are diverse, and the consumers and the communities in which they live that are also very diverse and becoming more and more diverse. That then sets the stage for monumental and systemic change. So I want to stop here and wrap by saying the following things. And then hopefully we have the basis for conversation and discussion. And that is, I believe that corporations are uniquely positioned and resourced to impact the lives of every individual in this country and even on this planet. Their profit motive results in wide sweeping impact. We've seen it all the time, both positive and negative. But in a world where multicultural is no longer an ambiguity, but it is a pending reality, sitting on the sidelines or taking a passive approach is no longer acceptable. The sidelines, quite frankly, they're full. What we need is players that are on the field, and if we want to win the game. And so it's time to be bold. It's time to imagine. It's time to be creative. And most importantly, it's time to engage. So thank you for your time today. I'm happy to take questions, any questions that you might have. And lastly, I'd just like to say, I hope that this is a wonderful conference for everyone that is involved and that you take away something that's meaningful for you as you think about what you want to do going forward. Thanks. All right. So I'm not sure if anyone's going to join me for Q&A, but I'm going to read at least one question that we received from the chat. And It says, how do you recommend people not in leadership positions at companies inspire motivation to action for more inclusive D&I, especially when there is a lot of performative theater happening internally? Okay, fantastic question. And I suspect there are many other people who feel the exact same way. Here's what we know. In 2020 and now 2021, I will tell you that there has never been a time, I don't believe that there's ever been a time in which more people were listening to you now than ever before. Now, that doesn't mean you can just walk into the CEO's office and say, hey, I've got some great ideas and I need you to listen to me. You can't necessarily do that, but in many ways you can. And so one of the things that I've encouraged individuals lately is that there's a lot more power today in the unity of more individuals within the organization. It doesn't have to be the most senior leaders within the organization, because the things that are changing today are happening from the top down and they're happening from the bottom up. And so I would encourage you to look at some of these folks, some of these functions that I just mentioned, look at what some of the other organizations are doing, other companies, and start to have that dialogue and approach some of these leaders. You know, if you're not considered senior leadership within the company, this is the perfect time for you to come in and have that dialogue with someone who is a senior leader within the company, and to and serve and set as a foundation for that conversation. Hey, I'm seeing some other things happening at other organizations that are two things. They're strategically relevant for the business, and they happen to be touching on this very relevant topic around diversity. I care about both things. I will tell you that I care about the first thing more. I want to see our company be super successful. So can we have this conversation? And because you have data points from other organizations, that's where you can start to create a level of agency to say, I think there's something we can do here. And then the last thing I'm going to say about that is, don't be shy about not only reaching out to members of your own organization, but reaching out to some of the same people that you're seeing being identified in some of these press releases and other activities that are taking place. The lines of communication are open. There are so many conversations being had behind closed doors, one person of color to another person of color, one woman to another woman in different organizations, to really start to figure out what else can we do? How can we move the ball forward? So hopefully that's helpful advice. I have another question, which is, when you're evaluating companies to either join as a company or partner with as an organization, what criteria would you recommend using to evaluate that their D&I initiatives are truly inclusive and future-proof? That's a great question. To me, one of the most meaningful and perhaps insightful metrics you can use, or signals you can try to discern as you're looking at one organization to the next, you got to really get an understanding of who's in charge and who's leading the efforts. Understand their motivations, understand how long they've been there, and try to have a dialogue with them to understand what keeps them there and how they see the future. We've seen a lot of turnover at the senior levels of organizations, people who are responsible for D&I efforts, et cetera. If you go and look at some of their backgrounds, you'll see that there is this regular movement, moving every 3 to 4 years, et cetera, or even less. That is a warning sign. You got to look at that and say, well, is there really cover here? And do we really have the foundation to make substantial change? So I would start to try to evaluate who are the people at the top, who's driving the change, and try to assess how committed are they to it. And then the other thing I would say is understand, or try to understand, if the organization itself, from a corporate activity perspective, like the business itself, does it recognize the importance of the multicultural mainstream? Like, does it really recognize that that's important to it, that is important to the future of its businesses? And is that seen in its product development, in the way that it sells, in the way that it engages with customers, et cetera? Because those are also indicators of whether or not this is the kind of company that's going to make sense for you to join, if those are the things that matter to you. Got another question, which is, at your firm, what do you look for in founders to determine if they are interesting enough to invest in? So I chuckle here a little bit because this is always a difficult question for a VC to answer. But we have our traditional metrics, which are always kind of around, we really want to invest in fantastic teams. We want to make sure they're working on really big problems and challenges that if they are right and they're successful at it, then everyone's going to benefit from that. And those are probably the two major things. Now, what I'm also going to say is that the type of firm that Aperture is building is one that is far more inclusive in the way that it looks at companies, in the way that it looks at its investment opportunities. And so the diversity of the team really matters to us, and it matters to us on multiple levels. Number one, it's a reflection of the type of individuals we're about to get in business with. That is mission critical for us. And number two, it also creates the opportunity to ensure that a different level of thinking and connection is being injected into the product or into the solution. And so we know then, therefore, that inclusion is in the DNA of the solution, and that there are some things that we're not going to have to educate the team on. And that therefore means that they're going to have other degrees of freedom that will allow them to build and ideally build faster. And then the last thing is we're always looking for a way to connect the folks that we invest in with, in our model, many of the corporate investors that we have, because we're looking for opportunities to connect those two groups in ways that are going to be extremely meaningful and impactful to the ultimate outcome of the startup. So we have a slightly different twist. We like to say that we are the diversity investing arm for the world's leading corporations. And so we take that approach and we try to use that in every decision that we make from an investment standpoint. All right, another question. Regarding strategic cooperation across corporations for specific impact goals, who are current players driving this, especially in the communication strategy space? Ooh, so I think that every organization is struggling right now to get this right. And when you talk about the communications industry in particular, they've been challenged on a number of levels. Number one, their industry itself is not as diverse as it should be. And I'm gonna throw in media and advertising as well. They've been struggling with this problem for many, many years. So their teams aren't that diverse, which means that the solutions they're trying to drive aren't reflective of the inclusion that they need to have. Now, that's a problem for them as a business, as an operating entity, but it's also a problem because they're now trying to secure clients that are under similar pressure. And so the clients are coming back to them and saying, I need more X, I need more Y in our products and in solutions and the creative solutions you guys are bringing us. And if you can't do that, we're going to go get it from somewhere else. And on the other side, the media organization is saying, well, look, we're trying, we're doing the best that we can, but we're not seeing them, et cetera. It's all of the usual reasons. This is why I go back to that notion of the ecosystem approach, because I think that that industry in particular has an opportunity to partner with others that are in and around their space and can drive some significant change. So I'm going to give one highlight because it's something that just happened. And we just saw where Shaquille O'Neal has announced that he, along with some other business partners, are going to launch a creative agency where their target is 75% diverse is their target for all the employees. And it's an agency that's going to be literally focused on the multicultural mainstream. And, that level of boldness is exactly what we need right now, because it now is going to put a significant amount of pressure on the communications industry, because now everyone's got to kind of compete with an alternative, and an alternative that feels a lot more like home for a lot of the people that everyone's been fighting for. What it also does is it creates another source of creativity, inclusive creativity, that perhaps Nike and Verizon and some of the other major corporations, they don't have today. It's a new option on the table. That doesn't mean they're going to throw away, some of the major houses that are out there for advertising and communication strategy, but it creates a new alternative, and it creates a level of pressure that is going to force everyone to make the adjustment. Now, I don't know if Shaquille O'Neal will be successful with it. I hope he is, but I think that it's an instructive, an illustrative example of what we have to start seeing more and more across all industries, not just in the creative industry. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, William. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. We're running over time, actually.
Sorry
and
about
I want to
that.
be super cognizant of your time. We have one question. It's a burning question. What are you having for lunch today?
I don't know. Is that the meal that you have after breakfast? Because I didn't have that either.
He's a busy guy, folks. Well,
We'll
thanks so
figure
much,
that out.
William. It's been a real pleasure having you. Beautiful conversation. I think we got through all of the questions.
Awesome.
And for those who are just tuning in, this is the first keynote of our 2-day conference. Like William had said at the beginning, Multicultural Mainstream is here, and it's here to stay beyond this conference. We hope you enjoy